They moved through the hall with voices that filled the air, voices that demanded attention, that pressed against the quiet like wind against a fragile door. And yet, in the midst of all that sound, he did not answer. He did not raise his voice. He did not meet their words with his own. He simply listened, not because he feared them, not because he lacked strength, but because he had learned that silence often spoke louder than any cry. Have you ever noticed how the smallest sound can feel heavy when the world is quiet? How a single word can tremble and fall like a leaf onto the still surface of a pond? That is the kind of silence he carried within him, not empty, not hollow, but deep and patient. A silence that held space for everything, even for the anger and the pride of those around him. They thought their words would move him. They thought their presence alone could unsettle the calm he had nurtured over years of quiet observation. Yet he felt nothing but a gentle awareness. He noticed the rise and fall of their voices, the flicker of tension in their movements, the restless energy that demanded release. And still, he did not reach for retaliation. He did not sharpen his mind to meet theirs in argument. Instead, he let the silence stretch between them, wide and unbroken, like a river that flows without haste, untouched by the stones that lie beneath its surface. It was not emptiness that he offered, but something far more difficult to hold. Patience, restraint, a quiet presence that needed no approval, no recognition, no audience. In that stillness he discovered a truth that is rarely spoken aloud, that the world will often try to disturb you, and yet the deepest power is found in remaining unmoved. Have you ever felt it, this quiet power? The kind that does not shout, does not demand, but simply exists and waits. And in that waiting, he could feel the small tremors of his own thoughts, the temptation to respond, to defend, to strike back in some clever way, whispered at the edges of his mind. But he did not follow it. He let the whispers pass like clouds across the sky, knowing that the moment would not lose meaning if he allowed them to float by. The real weight, he understood, was in the pause, in the careful breathing, in the quiet observation of his own heart before any action. It is strange, perhaps, to think of silence as strength. For most, silence feels empty, awkward, a space to be filled quickly. But here, in this quiet hall, it became a kind of armor, invisible yet impenetrable. He could sense the impatience of those around him, the small frustration that tugged at their faces, the brief flicker of doubt that crossed their eyes. And yet he offered nothing but calm, nothing but stillness. It was as if the air itself had learned to pause with him, to bend to the rhythm of a heart that refused to be hurried. And in that stillness he saw something else. He saw himself reflected, not in the words of others, not in their judgment or their anger, but in the quiet steadiness of his own mind. How often do we search for strength outside ourselves, in the noise, in the recognition, in the fleeting applause of others? And yet here it was not found in answering, not in proving, not in striking back. It was found simply in being, in listening, in the small, steady beat of a life undisturbed by chaos. Sometimes, when the hall was empty and only the echo of steps remained, he would wonder at the strange power of quiet, how it could hold sway over minds that thought only words could rule, how it could calm hearts that sought agitation, how it could make the loudest voices feel small without raising a finger or bending a single thought. And still it was gentle, never cruel, never forced, a soft, enduring presence that asked nothing, demanded nothing, yet contained everything. Can you feel it, the weight of silence? Not the silence of absence, but the silence of attention, of care, of careful watching without interruption. It is not always comfortable. It asks for patience, for endurance, for a surrender of the desire to prove, to fight, to be seen. Yet within it there is a quiet victory, a kind of justice that does not strike, that does not shout, that does not move outward but inward into the core of who we are. And so he remained, listening to the rise and fall of voices, watching the currents of emotion pass through the hall, feeling them but not carried away by them. He breathed slowly, each breath a reminder that the true measure of power is not how fiercely one can act, but how deeply one can remain at peace while the world around him trembles. That is where he found the beginning of all strength, in the quiet before the response, in the calm before the storm, in the gentle, unshakable truth that some of the greatest victories are never seen but quietly held within. Would it not be something, he thought, if we all could learn to sit with our own stillness, to let the world speak while we simply listened, to find in silence not emptiness but a kind of quiet justice that moves like water, soft, patient, unstoppable, and entirely our own? They spoke again, their voices sharper this time, edged with impatience and expectation. Yet he remained still, as though their words were leaves drifting across a pond, unable to disturb the water beneath. And still he felt the subtle weight of being misunderstood, a quiet ache that settled deep within his chest. How strange it is, he thought, that the world so often sees only what it wants, hears only what it expects, and rarely notices the truth that hides in plain sight. They moved closer, their gestures heavy with assumption, their eyes searching for signs of weakness or concession. And in that search he felt the slow, familiar tug of discomfort, the kind that comes when your heart knows something that the world refuses to see. Have you ever felt it? That quiet misalignment between who you are and what others believe you to be, that small, persistent unease that whispers, they do not know you, and perhaps they never will. And yet, he did not rise to correct them. He did not defend himself with words or explanations. He simply observed. The subtle flicker of tension in their hands, the slight narrowing of their eyes, the way their mouths pressed together before speaking, he noticed it all, and in noticing he discovered something curious. Being misunderstood is not always a wound, but a mirror that shows how easily the world clings to its own stories, how it often confuses volume with truth, motion with meaning. He felt the quiet frustration that came from this misunderstanding, the soft burn that flickered in his chest and begged for release. And yet he let it be. He let it sit, not as a burden but as a teacher. It was in that still discomfort that he began to understand the subtle art of presence. That even when they misjudged him, even when they pressed their assumptions against his calm, he could remain unshaken. How fragile, he thought, is the need to be understood, and how strong is the heart that can live without it. They spoke of his actions, of choices he had made, of intentions they imagined, as if words alone could define him, and still he did not answer. He felt the sharp edges of their misunderstanding, the way it tried to slice into his patience, and he felt the small temptation to correct, to justify, to push back with equal force. But he did not follow it. He let the temptation pass like a shadow over the floor, knowing that the light within him would not be diminished by their darkness. There is a subtle power in being watched and misjudged, he realized. It is the power of keeping one's own center, the quiet certainty that truth lives within, not in the eyes of those who would misread it. And as he breathed slowly, he felt the tension in his body loosen, as if each inhalation reminded him that he was complete, even without their approval. How often, he thought, do we surrender our calm for the fleeting need to be seen rightly by others, when our own understanding of ourselves is more lasting than any judgment cast? From outside, they pressed on, their questions growing sharper, their assumptions louder, and still he remained silent. Not out of fear, not out of passivity, but because he understood the subtle rhythm of restraint, that not every injustice needs to be answered immediately, that sometimes the quiet endurance of patience speaks louder than all words combined. It is a strange lesson, he knew, that the world often interprets silence as weakness, when in truth it is the most deliberate form of strength. And in the quiet of their misunderstanding, he began to see more clearly than ever before. He saw the currents of emotion that ran beneath their words, the fears and desires that drove them to misread him. He saw the fragile way the world holds onto appearances and how quickly it replaces knowing with assumption, and he felt a gentle compassion, not for what they had done to him, but for what they did not yet understand about themselves. He wondered softly, as the echoes of their voices faded into the distance, whether they would ever grasp the depth of calm that had held him untouched. Perhaps not. Perhaps they would continue to weave their stories of who he was and what he might be. And yet he realized it mattered little, for he had learned the quiet art of carrying himself through misunderstanding, of holding steady when the world leaned toward chaos, of finding peace not in the recognition of others, but in the steady knowledge of his own truth. And in that space, between the words spoken and the silence he preserved, he felt a small, enduring strength take root, a strength that did not need applause, did not require explanation, did not depend on being seen as right or justified. A strength that grew quietly in the heart as he continued to watch, to breathe, and to be entire, unmoved, and quietly certain that the truest understanding always begins from within. He sat quietly, feeling the soft weight of the hall around him, listening as the voices rose and fell like waves upon the shore. There was a moment when he could have spoken, when a single word would have cut through the noise, a word that might have set them straight or shown them the truth as he saw it. And yet he did not. He felt the gentle tug of temptation, the quiet urging of his own mind, and he let it pass like a breeze moving through a room, leaving only stillness behind. Have you ever noticed how often we are asked to act, to respond, to prove ourselves before we are ready? How often the world seems to demand an answer before the heart has found its own. And yet, there is a peculiar strength in restraint, a kind of power that grows not outward, but inward, like roots reaching deep beneath the soil, unseen, patient, and unshakable. He felt the stirrings of his own thoughts, the small whispers that said, "Answer them, show them, defend yourself." But he listened instead to a quieter voice, one that spoke not in words but in understanding, one that reminded him that not all battles require a fight, that not every injustice needs immediate correction. And in that listening he discovered something rare, the gentle art of choosing silence over reaction. Silence, he realized, was not emptiness. It was not weakness. It was a kind of presence that carried weight without effort, that held its ground without movement, that contained more clarity than any argument ever could. When they pressed and prodded, seeking a crack in his calm, he did not falter. He did not rise to meet them. He remained still, observing the rise and fall of their expectations, the shifting currents of their impatience, the small sparks of frustration that flared and faded in the space around him. And he understood that he was untouched because he had learned to carry himself from within, not from the approval of those who could not see him. Have you felt it, the quiet satisfaction of restraint, the soft unfolding of peace that comes when we hold our tongue, when we do not strike, when we do not act until the heart is certain? There is a rhythm in such silence, a slow and deliberate cadence that cannot be hurried or forced. It is like water, moving gently through stone, persistent yet patient, shaping the world without violence, without need to be seen or acknowledged. And in that patience, he began to see clearly the nature of their words. They were sharp, yes, but often hollow. They carried the weight of expectation, the pressing need to be heard, but little understanding of the heart before them. And he felt a small compassion, not for himself, but for them, for the fear and urgency that made them seek to move him, to pull him into their own turbulence. How tenderly strange it is, he thought, that the world so often confuses reaction with justice, that it believes the loudest voice must hold the truth. He breathed slowly, each inhalation a reminder of his own center, each exhalation a release of the small tension that might have drawn him outward into the noise. And in that gentle rhythm, he realized that choosing silence was not a denial but an embrace. T was an embrace of himself, of the stillness that held him, of the calm that would not be shaken. It was the beginning of a quiet power, one that needed no witnesses, one that grew steadily with each moment of deliberate restraint. They spoke once more, pressing their ideas, their judgments, their assumptions, as if the sound of their voices alone could move the world, and he listened, fully present, fully aware, and yet entirely unmoved. He could feel the soft insistence of their energy, the small sparks of expectation, and he felt nothing but his own measured calm. It was as if the silence itself had become a shield, not hard or defensive, but gentle, unbreakable, and enduring. He wondered softly. As the hall grew still once more, how many of the world's disturbances could be met in this way? How much simpler it might be, he thought, to remain in quiet observation, to hold one's own center, to choose restraint even when provoked, to allow the world its stories while keeping the story within oneself untouched. And he felt a subtle joy, a quiet satisfaction, knowing that this choice, this deliberate turning inward, was a kind of freedom, a freedom that neither anger nor misunderstanding could ever take away. In the calm of that decision, he felt the small beginnings of a deeper strength, not the strength that acts outwardly, that strikes or proves or defends, but the strength that grows silently, steadily, in the heart that has learned to wait, to listen, and to remain unshaken. And as he breathed once more, letting the world settle around him, he understood clearly that the truest mastery is found not in reaction, but in the quiet, deliberate choice to remain whole, then when the world demands otherwise. The hall had grown quiet again, and with the quiet came a strange, gentle stillness, as if the air itself had learned to pause. They spoke once more, but their words no longer reached him in the same way. He listened, yes, but there was no tension in his shoulders, no quickening of the heart. Their voices brushed against him lightly, like wind across a field, and he remained unmoved. How curious it is, he thought, that the world can speak so loudly, yet touch so little when the heart is calm. He felt a subtle shift within himself, a soft settling, as though the echoes of earlier disturbances had finally been absorbed into the quiet of his own being. It was not a loud triumph, nor a sudden revelation. It was a gentle recognition, quiet as a candle's flame, that the power he had sought was never outside. It had always been here, in the slow beat of his own heart, in the measured rhythm of breath, in the simple, unbroken presence of being. He remembered the sharpness of misunderstanding, the weight of expectation pressing from all sides, the temptation to respond, to strike, to correct, and yet none of that remained heavy now. It had passed through him like water through stone, leaving only clarity, leaving only the calm certainty that comes from knowing oneself. Have you felt it, this quiet strength that does not need to defend, that does not need to be recognized, that does not seek to prove itself? It is soft, but it is steady, gentle but unshakable. He thought of those who had judged, who had assumed, who had spoken as if their vision alone could define the world. He felt no anger toward them, only a quiet compassion, an understanding of how small the world can seem when it relies on noise instead of seeing. And in that understanding, he realized that peace is not the absence of challenge, but the presence of calm within it. How often, he wondered, do we mistake peace for silence when it is truly the quiet mastery of the self amid the storm? The hall seemed to breathe with him, slow and steady, as if it too had learned the rhythm of patience. He could feel the soft pulse of his own awareness, the gentle echo of every breath, the warmth of a heart that had not been moved by anger, not shaken by misunderstanding, not disturbed by expectation. And in that pulse, He recognized a small, enduring truth that true justice, true power, is not given by others, nor taken from them, but held quietly, gently, and firmly within. And yet there was no pride in this knowledge, no need to announce it, no urge to make it visible. It existed simply because it existed, like a river that runs beneath the earth, unseen but steady, shaping the land without spectacle. How strange it is, he thought, that the most lasting power is not loud, not sharp, not demanding, but soft, quiet, and patient, that it grows in stillness, in restraint, in the careful tending of one's own heart. He let his gaze drift across the empty hall, noticing the soft light that lingered in the corners, the gentle shadows that moved slowly across the floor, the small echoes that remained from voices long gone, and he felt a quiet gratitude, not for any recognition, not for any victory, but for the simple gift of stillness, for the chance to witness the world without being consumed by it, to feel the flow of events without being swept away, to exist quietly and fully in the truth of oneself. Have you ever noticed how small moments of calm can feel infinite, how a single breath can stretch into a universe, how the stillness between words can carry more meaning than the words themselves? He felt it now, a small, soft expanse of inner space, wide and open, free from the need to react, free from the weight of judgment, free from the pull of expectation. And in that space, he rested, fully present, fully alive, fully himself. He understood, finally, that respect and dignity were not given by others. They could not be granted, nor could they be taken away. They lived quietly in the heart that refuses to be hurried, that does not need the approval of the world, that carries its own center with gentle steadiness. And as the last echoes of the hall faded into silence, he felt a deep, abiding calm, a soft certainty that would remain long after words had ceased, long after voices had passed, long after the world had moved on. It was not loud, it was not triumphant, it was quiet, gentle, complete, and in that quiet he was free, in that gentleness he was whole, in that stillness he was strong, and perhaps, he thought softly, this is the kind of justice that endures, the justice held within, unshaken, calm, and quietly powerful.